I'm Byung Liu, and you're listening to the Changelog.
Welcome back, everyone. This is the Changelog, and I'm your host, Adam Stacoviak. This is episode 217, and today Jared and I are talking to Byung Liu. Byung is the CTO and co-founder of Sourcegraph, and Sourcegraph is aiming to be the Google for code. We talked about the backstory of Sourcegraph, how it works, ideas around offline support, how it's licensed, which led us to talk about their new software license called FairSource. We have two sponsors today, Linode and DataLayer, a one-day event organized by our friends at Compose. Learn more at datalayer.com. Our first sponsor of the show is our friends at Linode, cloud server of choice here at Changelog. Get a Linode cloud server up and running in seconds. Head to linode.com/changelog to get started. Choose your flavor of Linux, resources, and node location. Plans start at just $10 a month. You get full root access, run VMs, run containers. You can even manage your Linodes from the comfort of terminal using Linode CLI. They've got SDKs in Python, Perl, PHP, Ruby, JavaScript, Node.js, so you can hack away on your Linodes with their API. Take advantage of add-ons like backups, node balancers, DNS manager, and more. Again, use our code CHANGELOG20 for $20 in credit with unlimited uses. Tell your friends. Head to linode.com/changelog. And now on to the show. All right, we're back. We got Byung Liu here from Sourcegraph. Jared, we like to trudge through open source, right? And not just open source, but the details of it, the functions, the language, and see where their use cases are. And this is exactly what Sourcegraph does. And
yep.
So Byung's here obviously to tell us about his company, but also all the cool open source they're doing at Sourcegraph.
Yeah, and I feel like Byung's kind of he's been on Beyond Code, and then recently he was featured on GoTime, and now he's on the Changelog. So that's the
he's making his rounds.
It's like hitting for the cycle.
Yes.
Thank you guys for having me. It's great to be here.
Well, Byung, let's begin with your origin story. I think that graduated from Stanford, you got a unique path to where you're at today. But aside from working at some cool companies and figuring out some developer problems, where did things actually begin for you? Like, how far back do we go to figure out where you got your interest peaked around open source or around software development?
Well, if you want to go origin story, I guess I should start with my birth. I was born in China, but I was raised in the Midwest. I always like to mention that in case there are any Midwesterners out there listening.
You're talking to Midwesterners.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, you, Jared, you're out in Nebraska, right?
I'm in Nebraska, and Adam's in Texas. So yeah. There you go.
Texas. Nice. That's awesome. No wonder you guys are such nice guys. Yeah, so I grew up in the Midwest, but came out to California for high school, and I think I first got into programming just, I had to buy a TI-83 graphing calculator for some, I think it was like high school geometry.
Yes.
And I happened to get the version of the calculator that came with like the 500-page reference manual, which not all versions come with, but this thing is like it's got everything you ever would want to know about the TI-83 calculator, and it includes a section in the back that teaches you how to write the dialog of BASIC that they have on the calculator. And so I would, when I was taking the bus back and forth from school, I would just kind of like whip that book out and try to program stuff on the calculator in my spare time, program some cool animations or some, automated formula calculators. And that's kind of how I got into it. And I liked it enough that after that, my school offered a computer science class. I ended up taking that. Had a great teacher.
Can I stop you for a second, Byung? Because
yeah,
I had the TI-86 in high school, which is like pretty much the exact same calculator.
Yeah.
And mine also came with the manual, but mine came with something that to me was better than the manual, which was the game Nibbles, which is basically, did you have that one on yours?
No, I did not have Nibbles.
See, now this could have changed the course of your life, because I had Nibbles. Therefore, I was not going to program anything into that thing. I just tossed the manual out and just play Nibbles the entire way to school.
Yeah.
So lucky you.
The TI-86, I think, had a slightly faster processor. I was always envious of the folks who had that.
Maybe that's why it came with Nibbles stock and yours didn't. That's probably why.
Yeah, it just had just enough RAM to run Nibbles.
Exactly. Anyways, keep going.
Yeah, I had a great teacher by the name of Mr. Oliveris in high school. He was great at just laying down the facts for computer science. Ended up kind of loving it. Went off to college. I knew I wanted to do something math or science related, and computer science just seemed like kind of like the perfect marriage between stuff that was theoretically interesting, but also stuff that would have kind of a real world impact. So that's kind of how I got into this whole thing.
So you got this calculator, obviously, and Jared, you mentioned that you had one similar to the TI-86, and Byung, you got the TI-83. And Jared, many people that come on this show, their origin stories sometimes begin with gaming, and whereas Byung,
Right.
his history, it sounds like Byung, if this, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like what you're saying is that you were really interested in the sciences, which I think most computer scientists are, anyways. But you're kind of interested in sciences, but more importantly, the things that you can actually implement today and change the world around versus being interested in simply just games to get you excited about that. Is it fair to say that, or is that not the truth?
Yeah, I'd like to think I had so noble of a mentality back in high school, but to be honest, I think the reason why I never got into Nibbles or any other calculator game was I just had no patience for reading through how to install those things, and the calculator didn't come with any games pre-installed. And
Right.
I like Googled some stuff on like how do I install I think the game that everyone else was playing was like Penguin, which is this like Super Mario clone. And I could just never quite figure out how to install that on my calculator, and then I just gave up. So it was really out of sloth and laziness.
I like that. Well, laziness means you make a great programmer.
Yeah.
And maybe another question might be: is do you still have the manual? Do you still have this 50-page manual lying around by any chance with notes in it,
Yes.
bookmarked and
Yes,
stuff?
I do. It's still on my bookshelf.
Wow.
Awesome.
Yeah.
It sounds like you had kind of a straight and narrow path to where you are in terms of education and desires. And lots of people kind of change they're not sure what they like. Maybe they find out through video games. Maybe they find out through reading books or whatever it happens to be. Other people take completely different course changes in life or in career before they end up being in software. Take us to where we met you. So this is a GopherCon. Was it 2015?
Yep.
July
Yeah.
2015 GopherCon. You now have the Sourcegraph thing. Maybe it's a company at this point. Maybe it's just a side project. But you meet us there. You're into Go, and you have this Sourcegraph. Your answer to the most influential open source project for you was SourceLib, was what you said when we asked you that question. So
Yeah.
take us from where you just left off. Bring us all the way back up to the near present, which was July 2015. How'd you get there?
Yeah, so I went to college, knew I wanted to do something math and science related. After I took the very first CS class at Stanford, I kind of knew that this was probably the right thing, at least for the next 4 years. So declared the major. I was fortunate enough to be accepted into a research lab as an undergrad. Stanford has this great undergraduate research program called Curis. And so I landed in Daphne Kohler's research lab, and she was a great mentor. She eventually became my advisor. I really got into AI research. For a while, I thought I was going to get a PhD in computer vision or machine learning, something like that. But after doing that for a while, I kind of decided that industry was probably where I wanted to be more. And so I started looking around for companies that I thought were doing interesting things with large data sets. And at that point in time, this was 2011. Palantir was a big presence in the Stanford campus at that point, and it seemed to me that they were tackling some really interesting problems with large data sets and doing really impactful things in the world. So I decided to join them, landed on the commercial side, which basically works with a lot of companies in industry to help solve their most important technological and software related problems. And it's kind of there that I got to work closely with my future co-founder Quinn Slack. We'd gone to school together and kind of knew each other from there. But it was at Palantir where we really, got to spend some quality time together. And that was also kind of a tipping point for me because I think a lot of the roots of Sourcegraph were planted in that experience. So Quinn and I are both CS majors by background, so we both kind of had this pain that I think every programmer feels, which is like, man, it seems like it's harder than it should be to find existing code and reuse it. Like it just seems like I'm spending too much time, searching the internet, crawling through, random forums, trying to find the answer to how to do this pretty straightforward thing in code. And so we felt that kind of day-to-day pain as programmers, but the experience at Palantir kind of showed us that this was a problem that's not just relevant to programmers now. It's actually relevant to, say the top leadership at one of the big 5 banks in the US. Because what we realized was, right now we're kind of this point where software is becoming mainstream. And what I mean by that is, it used to be that for non-technology companies, technology companies that are outside of Silicon Valley, software engineering was kind of an afterthought or just a small department, or that they might outsource it to some other firm. But these days, it's becoming more of a core competency. More and more of the core logic of the business is actually captured in the logic of code. And that's what we realized working at Palantir with the types of customers that we were working with. And what we realized was, as painful as it was for us, the pain was felt 10 times as much outside of Silicon Valley, where companies aren't traditionally steeped in all the different processes and principles that we kind of soak up being immersed in the software development world, on how to run an engineering team and what tools to use to find the answers to everyday questions. And so we kind of took a step back and we're like, this seems like a solvable problem. Code is just another form of data. And at Palantir, we're building all these fancy tools for other sorts of knowledge workers to analyze their data sets. But the tools that we seem to be using as programmers, both at Palantir and at some of the customer sites that we're working with, still seem kind of primitive. The top 2 code search utilities today are probably Google search and grep. And Google is just kind of like the all-purpose fallback. Like when you have no other recourse, it's kind of like the Hail Mary. Like, I hope somewhere someone has written a blog post or an answer out there that answers my question. And grep is a great tool. It's a powerful tool, but it was written in the 1970s and hasn't really changed much since then, even as the world of software has evolved around it. So then we kind of got to think about this idea. We didn't start working on it right away. I went back to school to finish up my master's. Quinn went off and started another company with some folks from Palantir. And then we kind of serendipitously met each other at some house party in San Francisco. Actually, it might not have been serendipitous. I later learned that Quinn's then girlfriend, now wife, she knew that he was thinking about this problem, and she knew that I was going to be at this house party, so she kind of like orchestrated the whole meeting.
That's interesting.
Wow.
Which is kind of funny. But
you must send her nice cards for Christmas and stuff.
Yeah, she's great. But yeah, at the time, it felt like, oh, you're thinking about this as well. We got to kind of talking. And then we started just hacking on this and, got to a proof of concept pretty quickly that, at least in our minds, demonstrated the value that this could provide. And then we spent kind of the next maybe year and a half to 2 years just building it out and testing both like the technical side, which a lot of people didn't actually think could be done initially when we started, and also the product side, which is how do we actually make this something that people can rely on every day. And that, I think, brings us up to GopherCon 2015. We're a company at that point by then, but we're still relatively small. I think we only had a handful of people, but we were pretty. We had a good amount of traction by then, at least in open source, and it seemed like we were definitely onto something, and it was exciting to go to GopherCon and kind of share the tool that we'd built with the people and kind of see their reaction.
Yeah, it's interesting that you said a very similar sentiment when we interviewed you for Beyond Code that you just said here a few minutes ago. And what you said then in the last summer was, in the next 10 to 20 years, every interesting company is going to become a software company at its core.
Yeah.
And so this seems like an insight that you've had over time and continue to believe to this day.
Yeah, I really think, there's been a couple additional points of validation, I think. Have you guys seen General Electric's most recent ad campaign? I think they aired it during the Super Bowl, where they're kind of rebranding themselves.
Yeah.
They're a digital company that happens to do infrastructure.
Yeah, it's like they're both. Like, don't think about them that way anymore. Now think of them as like a software/hardware company.
Yeah, exactly. And that really indicates that they're putting software first. Another recent news item was the recent outage at Delta Airlines, where a software glitch basically shut down the airline for a day or more. And if we live in a world where a software bug like that basically shuts down makes it so you can't do business, that means that even as an airline, you may think your core business is flying planes, setting prices, and all of that is done more and more so in software.
I guess we've gotten this far here so far with your backstory, and we've mentioned Sourcegraph a couple times, even in the intro. I'm going to have to rewind myself and get upset because I didn't actually say what Sourcegraph is, but we're getting close to our first break. But before we go into that break, let's have you break down exactly what Sourcegraph is. Obviously, you've kind of teed up some of the ideas for which Sourcegraph was built around, but help our listeners understand. Then when we come back from the break, we'll go a little further into it. But what is Sourcegraph?
Sourcegraph is basically global jump to definition, find references, and documentation lookup across all the code you use, whether it's private or public. And it understands the code at a semantic level. So that means when you're jumping to a definition or searching for something, it knows the difference between a function call and the occurrence of, that particular name in some random doc string. So it basically, those are things that programmers do every day, and it's a tool that helps you answer the most common everyday programming questions in seconds.
There you have it. Let's take a break then, because we got tons of questions about Sourcegraph. Everything from licensing to what you're open sourcing, how you choose what to open source, why you even open source, and maybe some of the perspectives you have around how you license the different software you have and stuff like that. And this big idea of being able to be the Google of code, basically. So let's pause here, take a break, and when we come back, we'll dive a little further in. If you're focused on the data layer, there's an awesome conference being put on by our friends at Compose. Monolithic databases are so 20th century. Today, teams are using a JSON document store for scale, a graphing database to create connections, a message queue to handle messaging, a caching system to accelerate responses, a time series database for streaming data, and a relational database for metrics and more. It can be hard to stay on top of all your options, and that's why you should attend. While much talk in developer circles these days focuses on the app layer, not enough attention is placed on the data layer, and data is the secret ingredient to ensuring applications are optimized for speed, security, and user experience. Hear talks from GitHub, Artsy, LinkedIn, Meteor, Capital One, and several startups, including Elemento and DynamiteDB. Talks range from the Polyglot Enterprise to using GraphQL to expose data backed by MySQL, Elasticsearch, and more. The conference is in Seattle on September 28th. Tickets are just $99, and Changelog listeners get 20% off. Head to datalayer.com and use the code CHANGELOG when you register. We're back with Byung Lu, CTO of Sourcegraph. And Byung, before we took the break, we obviously got to get an explainer of exactly what Sourcegraph is, but it goes much deeper than this. It's the, I'm not sure if you coined this term or not, if this was the news stack or Susan Hall who wrote this article, but the title is Sourcegraph aims to be the Google for code. Mm-hmm. And being a public utility for all developers out there, being able to look up functions and dive into different usages of open source, whether it's private or public. Help us understand the beginnings of this company, what this company was founded upon, and why you actually built it in the first place.
As far as the beginnings go, it was Quinn and myself in the beginning, and it really grew out of this itch that we had ourselves as programmers, which was we felt that a lot of the code that we were writing was somehow duplicative. Either, someone in our company had probably already written it, or there's probably some open source library that we just weren't aware of, or just, couldn't figure out how to use that might save us a lot of time. And, I think, almost every professional programmer is aware of how often programmers reinvent the wheel every single day. And we're trying to think about, how we could encourage more code reuse. What was the thing that was preventing us from going out and discovering the pieces of code that we knew, someone somewhere had already written, but we just, it was just too difficult to find that out. And so we started thinking about it, and what it came down to was like, well, look, code is actually really like highly structured data. I come from a machine learning background and natural language processing. There's a lot of parallels between natural languages and programming languages. But the difficult thing about natural languages is that even to construct a simple parse tree from an everyday English sentence, that's still an open research problem. Whereas with programming languages, you have this thing called a compiler or interpreter that just gives you literally everything you'd ever want to know about a block of code. And once you have all that data, then you ask yourself, well, can I build a system on top of this that helps me automate or partially automate the task of finding pieces of code, of reading through existing pieces of code, and really like understanding that piece of code in a way that lets me use it. And so that was kind of the itch that we were scratching. And a couple other points of inspiration for us, the stuff that we saw inside of Palantir was definitely something that solidified our belief that this was not only a problem that programmers everywhere face, but it was also a problem that was important to leaders of large businesses. And the other point of inspiration that we took was I had previously done an internship inside of Google, and Google internally actually has this great utility. If you ever meet a software engineer who works in the main Google code base and you ask them what they think about Google code search, I guarantee you they will say it's the best thing since sliced bread. Just ask them how many times they use it every day, how often they have it open in some browser tab, and they'll tell you 60, 70, even 80% of the time I just have it open as a reference. And so seeing the value that provided inside Google, and also just missing that tool and not seeing it anywhere else in kind of the outside world, just made us want to build something like that, but something that could handle the entire universe of code and kind of empower every individual developer out there to go and take advantage of this giant corpus of human knowledge that is open source code and code inside your company, and kind of build on stand on the shoulders of giants, so to speak.
Definitely bit off a big problem in terms of just surface area, I think, with things to do, because even once you have the analysis done and you're collecting all the data, I'm sure you guys have some sort of crawler or something that's spanning the different code bases and, finding other pieces of code it can go index. Then you have, developers using all these different environments or editors. You have how many languages. Was it ever overwhelming to say, how can we provide support for all these popular editors and then across all these languages to where we actually going to provide a holistic solution for people?
Yeah, so that was definitely a kind of a sticking point in the early days, and one of the first technical hurdles we had to overcome was, how do we do this in a manner that's efficient? How do we make it so that we're not, 10 years from now, we're still writing, the plugin for the umpteenth language that we want to support, and that kind of leads into the creation of Sourcelab, which is the open source library that powers a lot of the underlying source code analysis that gives you what you see on Sourcegraph. And the basic idea of Sourcelab is, look, as far as end user applications are concerned, applications that want to make code explorable and accessible. So I'm thinking, editor plugins, things like Google Code Search or Sourcegraph. Most programming languages are basically the same. They all have a way to define things and name them and reference those things in some other part of code. So if we can kind of put the data that is the code in a form where you just capture kind of like that essential part of it, and it's a kind of common language agnostic schema, then you can just build your end user application on top of that single schema. And then underneath, you just have to build a bunch of translators from different languages to that schema. So that takes it from this problem of having to build a specific library or plugin for every combination of editor and language to, okay, now you just have to build a translator for every language to the schema. And then once you have that, you can build a single application that understands all those languages at once.
It's like the adapter pattern for languages.
Yeah, exactly. It takes it from of O of n squared or O of n times m problem to an O of n problem.
Right. So that was where you started. And so what I would like to find out about is the schema that it gets translated into. Like what are the bits and bobs that you guys need for each of these, the normalized version, and then how do you store those?
Yeah, so the schema, it's a graph schema. So the schema is in the name of the company, the Sourcegraph. It's literally like a graph of source code, and so there's kind of three fundamental concepts in the schema. So one is kind of the AST node. So this is kind of once you've parsed the code, this is like the essence of the code. Like once you have the AST, then you can kind of derive every other fact about the code that you need from that, and you can also translate it back to text. It's like the perfect. I guess you could say it's like the natural form of code as data. And then in addition to the AST node, the things that really let us kind of build useful features on top of it are two concepts: a definition and a reference. So a definition is just it's a function declaration or a class declaration or a variable definition somewhere in code. It's basically anywhere you define a name in code. So we extract all those and we produce a unique identifier for each that's global to all the code in the world. And then on the other side of the table, you have references. So references is anytime one of the names that you define in code is referenced. So it could be a function call, it could be a type reference, it could be a package import. And once you have these two things, definitions and references, that essentially allows you to walk the graph of source codes. If you think about the things that we do probably hundreds of times per day as developers when we're kind of exploring the data set of the code we're working on, it's following forward and backward links. It's either jumping to definition or finding references. And that's kind of the bread and butter of what we do, and that's exactly what the schema allows you to do. The main difference is that because of that globally unique identifier, you can now do so across all the code in the world, rather than just the code that's on your local machine.
Which is pretty rad. So SourceLib, open source, MIT license, sourcelib.org. We'll link it up in the show notes. That seems like you've opened up a core piece of your guys' business. Is that not the case?
Yeah, it's a good library. I would say, for us, it's just something that felt like it should be an open standard because it's going to be useful, I think, for a lot of tools beyond just Sourcegraph. We hope that this is one wheel that people shouldn't have to reinvent when they're trying to build great tools for developers. As far as the business case is concerned, we really think that the value we're going to provide to companies is scaling this across the entire open source universe and the code inside their company and connecting those two different worlds of code together. So there's a lot of additional technology that we built around scaling this, making it super fast across all the code that you might use that is not in SourceLib. SourceLib is kind of the analysis primitive.
Mm-hmm. Also seems like a really nice way, and I know people hate when we use the word leverage, but when you take advantage of, well, that sounds bad too, but just kind of the open source spirit, right? Where what you have, especially when you have like an adapter situation where you have all of these uncommon interfaces, and what makes your guys' end goal and end product better is the more adapters that you have. So for instance, you may not have the time or the capacity to write the Elm, what do you call them, analyzers, or the language analyzer that would conform it to SourceLib. But the Elm community, when they see you can use Sourcegraph on GitHub and look at the Go code and see what it does, they think, oh, I want that. They're going to get excited. They might actually build that for you. And then on the other side, you have your editors or your plugins. And you could have the same situation there. Maybe the Atom community says, why don't we have a Sourcegraph for Atom?
Yeah.
Or something, not Sourcegraph, but maybe something that adapts to SourceLib for Atom. And then they can do that. So it seems like a great business case.
Yeah.
For what's also beneficial to all of us as open sourcers is, we don't have to be the only ones building this stuff.
Yeah, exactly. There's so many use cases out there for a library like that we're not going to be the ones to think of, that someone else is going to think of it. And yeah, that's exactly what happened when we released it. There were a lot of people in the community that kind of reached out and said, hey, I want to build out support for this editor or this language. And it actually helped us on the business side too. One of the companies that uses Sourcegraph is Twitter, and we're deployed to Twitter's entire Scala code base. And there, they reached out at a point where we didn't even have Scala support. But one of their engineers wanted this so bad because he had also been a previous Google engineer, and so he wanted something kind of like Google Code Search, and so they actually built out Scala support as kind of a Hack Week project, and we kind of took it from there. Mm-hmm. So it's great to have the source code of your product just publicly available, because speaking as a programmer myself, it's just magical when I use a product, and then I can go and see kind of how it works internally. It kind of gets back to, people used to say that like in the old days, with hardware, back in the 70s, you'd buy an old clock radio or something, or an old computer, and you could just take it apart as a kid and kind of like map out how everything kind of worked. And that's kind of like a magical experience. Today it's not really a thing anymore because, hardware is so complex, and, who like some pieces of hardware, like even try to prevent you from kind of taking it apart and seeing how it works. And I just think as an engineer, it's just a magical experience where, you buy something, you get a lot of value from it, and then you can just kind of disassemble it and peer inside and see how it works.
Yeah. Or even in this case, make it better.
Yeah.
A lot of times when we open things up, we can't get them back together again. But with source code, you could always just git reset dash dash hard, and then you're right back.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I like the idea that I mean, this is obvious to most listeners, but with this being open, as you mentioned before, like it being an open standard, basically, it's an invitation to the community out there that if motivated enough, as Twitter was, as you mentioned with Scala, that in a weekend they could run a hack or something like that, or a hackathon internally or whatever, and build out their own piece, and it could possibly actually be adopted into the main repository or whatever. But like having that motivation, if you're motivated enough and having open source, you're able to build out your own thing based on that, or build on top of it if you wanted to.
Yeah.
And it's just like an open invitation to do that. I'm kind of curious though, whenever you search with Sourcegraph or do any of the stuff that you do, like this being, being able to search a function or whatever, what sources are behind Sourcegraph? Like what do you comb? How does that work?
So we crawl a lot of the major open source code repositories. So GitHub, Bitbucket. That's currently we crawl mainly like fully formed code repositories. In the future, we might also want to do snippets that are just found in blog posts and Q&A forums around the internet. But right now, it's just kind of like the go-to places where most open source code is hosted.
Did you have to do anything special to get access to that, or blessed API access, or anything like that? Any sort of relationship you have with the code hosts?
No, nothing formal. So we hit their APIs for some metadata, but by and large, we mostly just hit the Git API. So just like git clone, that kind of thing. And that's nice for us because a lot of companies don't use like a well-known code host internally. They just have a Git repository, and so you can just point us to any Git clone URL, and we'll be able to index that code.
So whenever you do that, are you actually pulling down the full repo? Walk us through what actually happens whenever you ping a source, you pull back the whole schema translation you talked about before with the SourceLib. What happens then? Like, what kind of data do you actually store about a repository and the code that's in it?
Yeah, so it's all kind of ephemeral. So, if you give us access to your repository, every time we detect a new commit, we fetch that commit, we clone the repository, and then we just run SourceLib as kind of a command line tool in a Docker container, and that outputs the data in the schema that we expect. And then pushes that to an API endpoint in the Sourcegraph web application. And underneath the hood, that then deserializes that and then stores it in one of several kind of underlying database systems that we have. And I guess so with SourceLib, it actually, the way SourceLib is structured is that it's kind of got this core orchestrator part of it, which kind of defines the schema and is responsible for coordinating the interface between SourceLib and the outside world. But underneath the hood, it just shells out to a bunch of different command line tools. We call them tool chains, and each of the tool chains is responsible for translating from a specific language to the thing that SourceLib expects.
You mentioned blog posts potentially being extended to this. I'm thinking back in the day of like micro formats. Is there some sort of spec that you plan on doing that might extend from SourceLib or whatever, or some sort of schema to adopt in terms of HTML, some sort of fragmenting to make that more possible? Like, hey, you scan any blog or any Medium post or whatever, and you auto discover anybody who wants to sort of offer their code samples up to SourceLib, or sorry, I guess Sourcegraph, not SourceLib.
Yeah.
What's your plan there?
Pre-tags.
Simple as that, I guess.
Yeah. So, we used to have this thing called source boxes that was really cool. It basically allowed you to embed an interactive code snippet inside your blog post. The only problem was the way we implemented it is this like JavaScript thing that you'd embed. So you actually couldn't embed it in a Medium post or like any other blog site unless you had the ability to post scripts to the site. So we kind of discontinued that, but we've been thinking about this a lot, and I think there's a couple of directions we could take. If any of your listeners are bloggers, I'd be curious to hear how useful they'd find this. But so one direction we could take is, you give us like any snippet of code, and we'll kind of parse it and emit HTML with links to the documentation and usage examples of whatever you call on Sourcegraph. Granted, when you send us the code, you'll have to give us enough context so that our analyzer can actually figure out what code your thing is calling. Like if you just type, http.new request, and just give us that one liner, that's probably not enough context for us to resolve that to, the new request method in the standard library. But if you give us, the import at the top, and a couple other lines of context, I think that should be good enough. And the other angle we're thinking of coming at it is we have this Chrome extension now that you can install in Chrome, and what it does is as you're browsing code on GitHub, it hits the Sourcegraph API and gives you jump to def and find refs and symbol search right in the GitHub UI, and a lot of people really like that. It also does that in pull requests, and that's something. It's really useful for code review. Just like being able to jump to def when you're reading through like a large code review is so helpful. But we're thinking about extending that to code snippets too, so that if you have the Chrome extension installed, let's say you come across some post on Stack Overflow that has a lengthy snippet that references some function, and now you want to figure out what that function does. The Chrome extension could link that snippet of code, so you can just hover over a reference to see the documentation and click it to jump straight to where it's defined if you want to go diving into the source.
What exactly, in terms of Sourcegraph, the product, and you can help us differentiate free versus paid or open versus licensed as well, but like, what is it in terms of how I use it today as a developer? Is it plugins? You got the Chrome thing? Do I go to your website? Give us the lay of the land.
It's free for open source and always will be. If you're using it inside a company, you can use it for free up to, I think the limit is 15 people now. And after that, there's kind of the standard per seat pricing model. As far as how you can consume it, we've actually experimented with a couple of ways you can consume it. So the most popular way of consuming it is just going to sourcegraph.com and using it as a web application that gives you, global search, global usage examples. So you get usage examples pulled from every open source library that might use a function, and a bunch of other stuff that's useful in the application. The other alternative is some people prefer a native application. So kind of the same way that Slack. The Slack native app is essentially the web application in a native frame. The Sourcegraph desktop app is essentially the same experience, but in a native frame, but with the added benefit of direct editor integration. So if you install a plugin, it'll add some shortcuts to your editor that make it super simple to look up stuff in Sourcegraph. So as you're coding, Sourcegraph will kind of like preload the documentation and usage examples it thinks are relevant to the code that you're writing, and so you can quickly alt tab over and get the answer to how do I use this function in a split second. Mm-hmm. And then there's a Chrome extension, which if you find yourself reading code on GitHub a lot, just install it. It's I'm biased, obviously, but I think it's a magical experience to click into code on GitHub and everything's just linked. Like you can hover over for documentation, and click on something, and even if it's defined in a completely separate repository, you're there.
What about language support?
Yeah, so language support, we support officially Java and Go. We have Python deployed to private beta. JavaScript's also in private beta, but we're not confident enough in the quality of those yet to make those public. Mm-hmm. But if you sign up for the beta, we'll try to get you on as quickly as possible. And then we have a couple other languages in the pipeline. And we have Scala inside some companies, but that's not public yet either.
Well, What's up with that, man? We got to get that like Twitter edit skull support. We got to get that for the rest of us, right?
Yeah. We're like, the Twitter dev team has been great working with us on that. We're just kind of going through the process with them right now.
I'm sure there are contractual agreements with that particular customer, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Very good. I think that helps us understand exactly what it exists in terms of how we could use it today. And I think we're going to tee up our next break. But I do have a question for you with regards to all the data that you're capturing. I think we should also talk about private source versus open source. But you're collecting a lot of data. I'm sure you're well aware of, GitHub's recent push into public data with the BigQuery, and I'm guessing that Sourcegraph has some overlap there, perhaps. So let's not answer that now, but let's just take a break and we'll answer it on the other side.
Every Saturday morning, we ship an email called Changelog Weekly. It's our editorialized take on what happened this week in open source and software development. It's not generated by a machine. There's no algorithms involved. It's me, it's Jared, hand curating this email, keeping up to date with the latest headlines, links, videos, projects, and repos. And to get this awesome email in your inbox every single week, head to changelog.com/weekly and subscribe.
All right, we are back with Byung Liu, and we are talking about Sourcegraph, source code, all that good stuff. Byung, we mentioned before the break that you are collecting a lot of data.
Yep.
I like how you think about code as data. Seems like a very powerful way to think because you end up with tooling like this. And recently, GitHub and Google made a big announcement around BigQuery and GitHub's public data set, where they have added not just the commits and issues, I believe it was previously.
Yep.
They now actually have full source code snapshots in BigQuery, queryable. And that was something that has been pretty cool and opened up a lot of opportunities to answer certain questions amongst open source people like us.
Yep.
I'm thinking that you guys have very similar type data, and perhaps there's some opportunities there with regards to reporting, analysis, what have you. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, totally. First off, I think it's awesome that GitHub and Google released that data. It's a really interesting data set. And there've been a lot of great blog posts written about that that have been just like really interesting to read about, certain patterns you can find in open source. I think, the data that we're collecting or that we're recording is the main way that it's different from that is my understanding is that the GitHub dump is basically kind of like a dump of source code as text, whereas on the back end with Sourcegraph, we actually go and parse out all the code. So we store, every function definition and method call and things like that separately as a kind of a distinct node in the graph. So there are certain, operations that might have a lower like false positive rate on top of the data set. That having been said, we've thought a little bit about the use case of like, hey, I'm a key open source author or I'm a senior engineer at my company. I want to go and analyze the code base to see, what kind of high level patterns I can discover. But at the moment, we're very focused on building for the day-to-day use case of developers. So helping developers answer the most common everyday questions they have in seconds. Whereas the type of analysis you would do with that larger kind of data set, in my view, is kind of something that you would kind of do every once in a while as a senior engineer, I think.
Mm.
Also, you have to be motivated too because it costs money. Not that that's like such a huge factor, but obviously, if you're going to pay per query or pay per size of queries, then you're going to want to think a little closer, to what you're actually doing. It's probably going to be a barrier to that entry. Not so much to pay for it, but if you had a general question, you might want to ask BigQuery in this data set. But generally, you got to be pretty motivated because you have to pay for it.
Yeah.
It's a disincentive whenever you have like pay per use, like querying, because like every time you do it, you're even if it's a small sum, there's like something in us as humans where we're like, oh, I gotta pay that. Oh, I'll just figure it out myself. Where when you're coding, like you want all that access at all times, and you don't want to have to be thinking, is this lookup worth it to me?
I guess the other question might be on the side of that, Jared, is like, so since BigQuery obviously is a paid tool and searching the GitHub data set on BigQuery is part of that, the question for Beyond might be, how do you make it free for one, and how do you make it fast like you have? Like, I think Brian Kettleson mentioned in the Go Time episode we talked about a couple of times on this show so far, was he actually had to uninstall something because it was a little slow, and you're aware of that. But for the most part, it's pretty fast to get these lookups back.
Yeah, so it really, I think, comes down to how we store the data. If we were storing all the code in the world as a text, it would actually be, pretty expensive to kind of comb through all that text and try to parse it with regular expressions and return answers in a live fashion. But the kind of high level way to describe it is we're taking advantage of structure in the data to make the problem of querying it faster. So, one of the reasons that search is a lot faster is we don't have to index every single token in, a string constant or a doc string. We can just scope our search to the functions that we know are actual, function definitions. And so that reduces the quantity of data that we have to sift through by a lot. And there's other sorts of gains that we can get on the back end because all the data that's coming into us is in the source lib schema as opposed to just this, file with a bunch of text in it.
Mm. You still have to be connected to the source, though. Is there any chance at like offline support, or I'm thinking of times of, bad latency, you're on an airplane, times where, you don't want to lose that customer who you don't want to lose Brian. He's got he's got his Vim open, he's got his Sourcegraph, and he's your customer, and now he's like, this is just either it's too slow right now or it's not available. These are probably things you guys are thinking about.
Yeah, that's an avenue that we're thinking about with desktop is just kind of getting the code that you're writing real time and getting that into Sourcegraph so that when you pop over to ask a question, it kind of has the data ready. But I do think that's a little bit more of a nice to have use case, just because if you're on an airplane programming, there's no Wi-Fi, then at that point you probably can't even look up documentation if the documentation is hosted online, or read the code on GitHub. So at that point you're kind of you're in the mode where hopefully you're not having to rely on external libraries that you don't know as much, and you're just you can be like, I try to, whenever I'm like about to take a plane ride, I try to think of like, okay, what's the most kind of like isolated coding task I could do? Like the thing that I can just like, be in the zone for, 5 hours and just hit the standard library for. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm with that. I'm also against it to a certain degree because pushback. I moved to the country and I have, Adam can attest to this. I have bad internet. And so I often find times where it's painful to work online. So sometimes I'll just go completely offline. And so in those cases, it's similar like you when you're getting ready for your plane ride. There are tools like on the Mac. There's an app called Dash, which is a paid app. If you are on the Mac,
awesome.
It's a great one, and it's a tool that many people are happy to pay for because it will offline all those and make them searchable and stuff. So, and I used to be swimming in bandwidth, and so I was like, who cares, guys? But, it's very narcissistic of me. But now that I have the problem, I experienced it firsthand, like having that is definitely a nice to have, but for some people, it's like it could make or break a customer. And so I would say like, think about ways that even if it's not the global source graph, right? If it's not like everybody's code, but it's at least either like hot code, like things I've been looking at recently, or my local repository stuff. I think having that would be a really interesting extension of what you guys currently do.
That's true. Yeah, you can actually use like most people use /code or /projects, where they keep all their source code locally. And you could even kind of crawl locally one particular directory or a set of directories based on a config.
Totally. That's actually a great point. Like one of the things
it's a good feature. Let's do that.
I like one of the things that we really want to make possible. You're in the country, the internet is terrible there. Another place that is terrible is the developing world, and there's a lot of people who
Hmm.
could become, great programmers and contribute to, the global uh, graph of knowledge and software. But they're kind of like hamstrung by, poor connectivity.
Yeah.
So like just kind of thinking out loud, like one of the things that we could do is, if you have code that you're working on your local machine, Sourcegraph is smart enough to understand what exactly you're depending on, because we can actually go and, parse the build file and figure out like these are the repositories that you're using.
Hmm.
And once we have that, we could just kind of like prefetch all the data for those things and store it locally and make that accessible. It'd be kind of like the equivalent of Google Maps, like save offline maps feature. So,
Right.
if you're going to go to like a zone of poor connectivity, or if you just happen to live in one, maybe you could rely on that.
Hmm. Yeah, it's not an easy problem to solve, but one thing that I've realized, and I think this is what you guys are going for with any developer focused product, is anytime you can make a developer say, "I love Sourcegraph," they're gonna, you're winning. And
Yeah.
every time I have to go offline and I can still work because of that Dash app, I say to myself, "Oh, I love this thing." And so like it's rare, right? Like most of the time I'm
Yeah.
online, everything's fine. But when I have to use it and it's there for me, that's when you turn like normal customers into customers that love your stuff. So
Yeah. Totally. And you know what? Like back when I first started like programming on a computer, I remember, in those days I was writing mostly Java and mostly the standard library. You could just pull all those you could just pull all that documentation down and have it on your local machine. So even if you're going to like someplace where you didn't have the Wi-Fi password, it was all there, and it was almost in some ways like a nicer experience because you didn't have the distraction of the
mm.
internet uh, while you're trying to code. I feel like these days it's like so many resources we look at are kind of in the browser, that it's
Mhm.
so easy to get off on a tangent. You're like you try to look into how to do this one thing, and then maybe the same forum post links to this other librry, and you
Right.
click on some other link, and sooner or later you're like on Hacker News, and you're like,
Right.
how did I get here?
Shavaniac.
Or you still have Twitter open in a tab, and they have
Yeah.
that thing that updates the page title with the number of notifications you have, and so you don't even have to view it. You're just there in a tab. Oh, I have 3 notifications on Twitter,
Yep.
and then you're just it's an hour later. You haven't done anything.
Yep.
Speak for yourself, Jared. So
Somebody else told me they did that last time. I don't
might have been me.
no
Maybe.
personal
I don't know.
experience.
So Byung, you mentioned that you've got this background in machine learning. That's a thing you love, obviously. And Jared mentioned that you're obviously collecting a lot of data. You think of code as data, and that's a cool way to look at this, obviously. So
Yeah.
you must have, not that this isn't a big enough plan, what you're doing with Sourcegraph, but you must have even bigger plans on top of all this knowledge, this wealth of knowledge you're ultimately building for the developer community. Can you at all share the future for us? Like, what's over the horizon? What's something no one knows about that you can at least tease us with what you're thinking about for the future of Sourcegraph?
Yeah, I'm happy to spitball. I just want to declare up front that, as of now, we're not working on any sort of machine learning related thing. Like as a person with a machine learning background, it kind of rubs me the wrong way. A lot of companies say they're doing they have some fancy machine learning algorithm, and really it's just mechanical Turk underneath the hood. And I just want to make it clear that Sourcegraph is not doing that. If and when we do use machine learning, we want to have a very clear use case in mind. Now, that having been said, one of the things that got me really interested in this problem in the first place was, as a person who likes data and thinking about how to model it, the data set of all the code in the world it's got 2 properties. One, it's extremely interesting because it's such a valuable data set, and there's so much information that's embedded in it. And 2, it's relatively unexplored. There's not a lot of tools that are specifically designed for reading and understanding that data. Most of the tools are optimized for creating the data, actually writing code. And so, from the get-go, this has been something that's been in the back of our minds. just to name a few things that we could do after we've collected the data set, kind of half-baked ideas. One is kind of intelligent autocomplete. So, we think of autocomplete as this thing that, it just queues off of compiler signals, and it gives you a list of, all the possible tokens that you could possibly, that are, syntactically, semantically correct to use at a given point in a file. But what if you could actually go beyond that and suggest, a variable name, or suggest a parameter value based on the surrounding context? Now, that prediction problem is a lot fuzzier. You probably won't be able to get that just from heuristics and what the compiler tells you alone. That's probably something that you want to learn. Like, okay, I've seen this pattern before in code, this pattern in the AST, and in the past, when I've seen the token, read, for example, and now this user is calling some function that reads a file, or writes a file, and what if they're passing, the wrong value of the permissions flag? They're setting it to, 0666 instead of, 0777. That's something that I think there's probably, given enough data, you could probably learn some interesting patterns there for, what things to flag to the user, that, hey, maybe you're hitting this API incorrectly because you're using it in a different way than the 100 other people out there in open source use it. So that's kind of like, one half-baked idea we have in the back of our minds. Another problem, which is kind of related to that, is in order to do that prediction problem well, a sub-problem you kind of have to solve is the scoring problem. So given machine learning, the way you'd phrase it is, given this piece of code, give me the probability that this piece of code exists or is valid. So you give it a likelihood score. And what that tells you is, if you see a piece of unlikely code, like a piece of code that your model thinks is like, oh, that's kind of interesting, more likely than not, it's an error. And you can flag that sort of thing. So you think about running this model. You train this model on all the code in the world, and you discover kind of associations, like associations of specific words and doc strings, and parameter values and function calls. And then you can actually, once you've trained it, you run it on all the code in the world, and you can kind of give a printout to people saying like, hey, in addition to the linter errors that you already get, here are some places where you might want to think about how you're calling this API. Or, hey, senior engineer, like one of your jobs is to make sure that the other people on the team aren't shooting themselves in the foot or incurring a lot of tech debt. Here's a daily printout of hotspots that you might want to scan that our model kind of discovered. So both those ideas are very half-baked. Haven't really explored them seriously yet, but I think given the structure of this data set and how novel it is, there's bound to be some great low-hanging fruit in there.
Yeah. Just as an aside, I find it amusing somewhat that you were in research and doing machine learning, and you left it to get more into the industry side of things.
Yeah.
And you flash forward to 2016. And like it's practically the most buzzword term of the entire industry. It's like everybody wants to do. Are we doing machine learning? Do we have any machine learning going on? So you couldn't actually be more industry right now.
It's it's I think it's both good and bad. Like, I'm glad that people are interested in machine learning. I think it can add a lot of value to a lot of products.
Yeah.
But along with the good also comes the hype, and
right.
it's kind of funny to watch.
Absolutely. Well, let's shift gears a little bit and let's talk about licensing. So we have a few different projects coming out of Sourcegraph. Of course, we mentioned SourceLib itself, which is MIT licensed. You also have some cool new things like Checkup, which we can talk about in a minute in detail.
Mm-hmm.
That's also MIT licensed, but you guys commissioned a creation of a new open source license called FairSource.
Mm-hmm.
And you even hired a lawyer to write it. Can you give us the background on FairSource, why it needed to exist, and what your thoughts are there?
Yeah, totally. So just to be clear, we don't consider FairSource open source, and we want to make sure that people understand we're not trying to pawn fair source off as an open source license. We think it's separate and distinct from open source, but we do think it has a place in the world. So the reason that we created the fair source license is that, you know, in open source, you kind of have this problem, and a lot of companies building open source technology have this problem where, you know, you want to build out something great, you know, a utility that people really rely on, and you want to make the source code publicly available, because it just feels like the right thing to do as a developer. You know, as a developer, if I'm curious, I want to be able to kind of peek underneath the hood and figure out how something works. Nothing's worse than when you encounter some bug and the thing that you're using is a black box and you have no way of fixing at all or even understanding what's going wrong. And so we wanted to make the source code publicly available, but at the same time, we wanted to build a sustainable business on top of this because we think that this is a really valuable problem we're solving. It's going to add a lot of value to both technology companies and non-technology companies alike. And we think that it's fair for you know, people investing time and effort into building these things to be compensated for the value that they're providing. And when we looked around, you know, the classic kind of way to do this is kind of the dual licensing model, where, you know, you release it as open source under some like really restrictive license, like GPL or AGPL, and then you have kind of a separate commercial license. But that just didn't seem like a great fit for us. It also, I mean, if you talk to lawyers in industry, there's actually a lot of concerns around that. You know, just like, oh, you know, what if we accidentally, you know, pull in the GPL part of your code base and we're not technically paying for it? And it just, there's a lot of like fear, uncertainty, and doubt from the industry side of things. And we kind of looked around and said, well, can we kind of take some things from open source and take some things from closed source and make a license that lets us release the source code publicly, but at the same time, you know, if a company like Twitter comes along and wants to use our product, we can charge them a fair price for the value that we're providing to their development team. And so we kind of looked around. We asked a bunch of open source contributors, you know, what they thought about the idea. We were really worried that we'd get a lot of pushback from people, because I think, you know, a lot of people, and rightly so, they have concerns about companies coming along and trying to cast things as open source that aren't open source. But what we found among open source authors was actually kind of this latent frustration at the fact that they're kind of investing so many hours of their lives. You know, a lot of these people have families and kids in addition to day jobs, and they're investing time and energy into these projects, and companies are using those projects to build things that make a lot of money, and the people actually building the underlying technology don't see a penny. And you know, that's bad, because if you're building something valuable for the world, you should be able to make a living off of it. And so, you know, talking to those contributors kind of gave us the confidence to kind of keep looking around. And then we ended up meeting this lawyer by the name of Heather Meeker, who I think was involved in drafting the Mozilla public license and a couple of other open source licenses. She's a lawyer who specifies in open source licensing law, and she had actually been thinking about this same problem, because, you know, she works with a lot of open source contributors as well, and she heard all the same frustrations, and it was kind of like very serendipitous. We met them through, you know, a mutual friend of the company, and she said, you know, I would love to take this on as a project, and we said, that would be great. Can you draft up something simple that we can use to release our source code publicly, but still retain the ability to build a business on top of it? And that's kind of how Fair Source was born.
Adam, we mentioned that Byung has pretty much hit for the cycle on the changelog network, but he actually hasn't been on request for commits yet. And,
not yet.
This sounds like a good topic for our brand new show with Nadia and Michael.
Yeah, that's with Nadia Ekbal, right? She was on the show a couple weeks back.
Yeah, she was on the show. We had her back. We had her on the changelog all the way back in January.
Yeah.
And then since then we enjoyed talking to her so much, and we told her if she ever wanted to do a podcast, she should come to us, and she did. And we've been working with her and Michael Rogers, is he the head of what is he in the Node Foundation, Adam?
He
Something.
is what's he? He's something for the Node Foundation. I'm trying to remember, community manager. That's what it is. Community manager for Node Foundation.
Yeah.
The Node.js Foundation. So
the entire show is based around the human side of open source and sustainability and licensing and governance and all such things. I think I'm sure Nadia and Michael have a lot of opinions about fair source, one way or the other, whereas I do not have very many opinions. Adam, what do you think?
I would say, well, I don't know. You got some opinions too, but maybe their opinions run deeper.
Yeah, they're probably more informed, whereas mine are just like gut reaction.
Yes.
Like, this is great, or this is terrible.
Yes, I would also say too that they actually have Heather Meeker on the list, and I think it would make sense, obviously, to add someone from Sourcegraph to that conversation too. It hasn't been scheduled yet, but I mean, this story is really fascinating in terms of like, especially how you said it's not to replace open source. It is not open source, and I think that's a good caveat to add to that, even before mentioning it like you did, because some, especially like me, I know that whenever I first looked at it, I thought that this was a new type of open source, and you explaining that portion of it makes it a lot more clear that you're not doing that.
Yeah, it's not open source at all.
Yeah. So I guess the plan for this license for you in this case was to be the license for your core application. Is that that's not open source yet though, right?
No, it's still a private repository at this point. We want to release the public code, the code publicly soon, but there's just some cleanup things that we want to do before we kind of are comfortable sharing the code with the world. So hopefully in the next couple of weeks, it'll be online. You can look it up on GitHub.
Have you done much discussing or talking out there on the internet anywhere about fair source and the motivations behind it and the plan for it?
Yeah, we've talked to, there's been some interest from open source authors. A journalist from Wired reached out a couple of months back, and my co-founder Quinn spoke to him and I think wrote up an article. But it's not been kind of a core focus of the company. Like the main focus right now is just building an awesome product for developers. This is just a means for us to release the product in a way that we think is kind of the right way to do it for developers.
Any common myths about this license you want to debunk right now?
Yeah, I think the main myth is that we're trying to cast it as like an open source license. It's not open source. We've tried to make that clear from day one. I think maybe it's just the fact that it's called like blank source. People confuse it. We're not trying to kill open source. We love open source. I personally have gotten a lot of value from open source software. I wouldn't have been able, as a curious, teenager, I wouldn't have been able to dive into the repositories that I dove into if things weren't out in the open. I use Linux as my programming environment, and the worst thing would be for this to like lead to the demise of the open source world. The main goal is just to let us release our code in a way that we think it should be released, and also give other code authors out there a way to actually see some of the value financially in terms of what they provide to companies that use their software. And I guess to that end, the license does include a clause saying like it's actually a parameterized license, meaning you can call it Fair Source 10 or Fair Source 15. And what that means is any company that's below the size of 15 people can use your software for free. And it's only after you hit that magical limit that then they need to acquire a separate commercial license from you.
I'm glad you mentioned that number there, because I was actually thinking about that. It's in my notes to mention, but I almost forgot. So how in the world do you track that? I was thinking, like, when I first read that, I'm thinking that's great, but how do you track usages of it? You have to kind of operate on this honor system. And then two, how do you create a conduit to get paid? Is it just a known way to pay someone? Like, how do they say, hey, I'm honest and I've used 16 of the 15 licenses and now I've got to pay for license number 16 or something? How does it work? How do you plan it to work?
Yeah, so we're not trying to make money off of individual programmers or super small teams working for mom and pop coding shops or small companies. The experience at Palantir has taught us that the problem that we're solving is valuable enough that it's the large and established companies that will pay us a lot of money to make their development teams more efficient, and so that's where we think the business is. As for the rest of the world, we just want to make this accessible to as many developers as possible because we think we built a tool that's great for learning and understanding code.
What about from the generalized license perspective? Like if I use FairSource 10, for example, how do I enable those who use it, companies, once they get to 11, 12, 13, how do I enable them to, one, be honest and say, hey, I've used it with 13 or 14 users versus the 10, so I need to pay for a few licenses or whatever.
Yeah.
And then how do I communicate to them how to pay? Is that just sort of on the license person who uses it to figure that out, or is it something that's actually baked into the license?
Yeah, right now it's it's kind of like the honor system right now, but the way we think about it is that there's no legitimate company in the world that would willingly violate a software license just so they could save a
few bucks,
$10, a few bucks a month on a piece of code. And as for the ones who are illegitimate and skirt the law, you're probably not going to make that's probably you're not going to
customers anyways.
Yeah, you're not going to build a giant business off of those people anyways. So
that was just some knee-jerk questions I had when I read it. I'm like, okay, so how do you enforce the honor system and how do you get paid? Because great, you got the license and great that you actually put that there, but how do you enforce it? Because if you don't enforce it or at least prescribe how you should operate around it, then no one's going to follow it. And I was just thinking, is that something that you've thought through? Is that something you have some suggestions on? And I'm just curious. That's a smaller subject though, but just curious.
Yeah, I mean, in the future, we think that there can be a more automated mechanism. If we're thinking from the Sourcegraph perspective, if you're using something like Sourcegraph that understands the dependencies you start pulling in through your code, you can have like an automated alert that tells you like, hey, you started using this thing that has a fair source license attached to it. If more than 10 people start using it, then you should pay this person. But that's just kind of like vague stuff that we haven't really built out yet.
Well, Biang, we're getting close to low on time, but we did want to touch on Checkup. We mentioned it earlier in the call and want to give you a chance to get that out there. A new piece of open source by Sourcegraph, and I believe built in collaboration with friend of the show, Matt Holt of the Caddy web server. He's also been on the changelog. He's also been on GoTime.
Yep.
So tell us about Checkup, simple uptime monitoring, distributed, self-hosted health checks, and status pages. What is it and why is it?
Yeah, so I'll kind of start with the why.
Okay.
The problem that it kind of solves was, like many web services, Sourcegraph uses an uptime monitoring service to make sure that our site is up and to make sure that someone gets paged when things go down. And we kind of ran into a couple of pains that were kind of surprising using the standard uptime monitoring services. The biggest pain for us was just like it was so hard to use the UI of these things. Like you think it'd be the simplest UI in the world. Like you got some URLs that you want to hit, and I put them in, and you tell me whether they're green or not. But a lot of the UIs just take like multiple seconds to load a single page. And you're sitting there as an engineer, like efficiency is the most important thing. And you're sitting there waiting for a page to load. You can't help but appreciate the irony that the thing that you're monitoring, that's monitoring your site to make sure that your latencies are below, 1 second itself is taking like 7 seconds to load. That coupled with the fact that there was no way to programmatically update the endpoints for a lot of services, or no easy way, I should say. And that kind of got us thinking like, well, this is uptime monitoring. It's not rocket science. It's actually like dirt simple. Ideally, we should be able to run these things as like unit tests. Like, wouldn't it be great if I could actually run uptime checks in development just to make sure that, that obviously you still need it in production in case some weird production issue comes up. But a lot of times you break an endpoint just because you pushed a bug that breaks a page that you could catch in CI or development. And so we got to thinking, and we really did not want to build this ourselves. We were like, surely there must be something out there that does this the way we want it to. But we looked around and just couldn't find anything. So we kind of, Matt Holt is kind of a friend of Sourcegraph as well. And we talked to him from time to time, and he kind of seen had his own frustrations of this sort. And I'm sure he's heard a lot from folks who use the Caddy web server. And so we kind of got talking, and he was like, I've been thinking about building this thing, and we're like, well, we'd love to sponsor you. We would definitely use it. And so he went and built this library for us. That's also a command line tool. And what it essentially does is you can run it as a command line tool, which means you can run it basically like on any, EC2 or Google Cloud instance. And what it does is you give it a set of endpoints, programmatically. It's some config file that you can version in with your code. You run this command, it hits all the endpoint, and then it uploads the data that it records to an S3 bucket. And then there's a separate command that pulls up a dashboard that pulls the data from that S3 bucket. And that's the thing that tells you whether your site is up or down. And so you can run the uptime command from any EC2 instances or any set of geographically distributed EC2 instances and pull uptime data from all across the world, push it to an S3 bucket, and then checking your uptime is as simple as running a command to display a dashboard. And as a side benefit, because it's so simple, you can also run it in CI or even development.
I love that. You got a problem, maybe you don't have enough time to do it yourself. Matt Holt has some time, and he also would like to solve said problem, and a beautiful thing happens. Spawn, that's the great new world of open source, where we do have businesses that are being run around open source and being successful, and we can sponsor little things that can benefit ourselves, but also benefit the whole community. So that's really cool.
Yeah, totally.
So that's sourcegraph.github.io/checkup. We'll link that one up in the show notes as well.
Mm-hmm.
Very cool. So is that kind of a thing that's just it's said and done? You guys launched it, or is there actually continued development? Do you have future plans for checkup, or is it just it's out there and use it?
Yeah, I think so. It's out there. It's usable. It's kind of like a minimal viable tool right now. So we're actively looking for other open source contributions. We've actually been overwhelmed by the sheer amount of interest. I guess it turns out that a lot of other people have had similar frustrations. But people have already submitted pull requests. One person added the ability to check for TCP endpoints as opposed to HTTP endpoints, and we've gotten a lot of other great pull requests as well. But if you're out there and you're listening and you want to contribute to libraries like this, then we're open for business. We're happily accepting pull requests.
Yeah, I've been working with Gerhard Lazu on the deployment of our new website and CMS and all that good stuff, and we have been discussing uptime monitoring. And he's a DevOps guy, and he has opinions on all the different uptime monitors in the world. The pingdoms, the uptime robots, the new shiny Apex ping, which it looks interesting. And one of the things is I asked him, like, what's the best one? Because I've been using this uptime robot thing, which I appreciate. It's free for me and cheap for many people. So I don't want to really diss it here on the show, but not the best thing that not fitting all my needs, but I use it. And he's like, I've used all of them. He's like, I have accounts on 9 different uptime monitors. He's like, they're all subpar in some way, and they all fall down in some way. He's like, I just use them all. So I think he's gonna be interested in checkup.
Yeah.
Sure. I would love to hear his thoughts.
Well, Byung, we would totally ask you the hero question on the show, except that you've already answered it on Beyond Code. So instead of doing that, we're just going to link up your interview on Beyond Code at GopherCon 2015. But one of the other closing questions we like to ask is really an invitation to the community. So from Sourcegraph to the community, what are the best ways, with your mission, with what you're doing, with all the things you have going on right now for the open source community to step in to support what you're doing or to help you move the ball forward towards the progress you're trying to make, whether it's, on the company side or on the open source side? What's moving Sourcegraph forward, and how can the open source community step in and help out?
Yeah, so I think the best thing right now is just try out Sourcegraph and use it to explore some open source code. Maybe use it to dive into that repository that you think is really cool, but perhaps is a little bit inscrutable or overwhelming right now. Because really the reason we made it was to make it easier to dive into unfamiliar code and to figure out what's going on, what it's doing. So use it for that. Hopefully it helps you. We'd love to hear your feedback, and if you end up liking it, tell your friends, tell your teammates, and help us spread the word.
What about language support or editor support or different areas where we talked earlier in the show about cross-pollination or motivations to look at where you're trying to go, and is there any unturned rocks out there that you just personally don't have time for? It's not on your roadmap, but the open source community can step in and help out.
Yeah, totally. So, even for the languages that we do currently support, the tool chains could always be better. The Go, JavaScript, Python, TypeScript. Those are the languages that we have kind of work in progress tool chains for. We'd love to get contributions for that. If your favorite language happens to be a language that's not one of those languages, if you reach out, we'd love to work with you on how to kind of build a tool chain for that. It's one of those tasks that I think building a source code analysis toolchain seems really fancy, but you just come talk to us. It's actually pretty straightforward, and you actually kind of learn a lot about the internals of programming languages and level up as a programmer when you do so. So if you're interested in any of that, just tweet at us or shoot us an email, and we're happy to connect and see how we can work together.
On your contact page, it's hi@sourcegraph.com. Is that a good email for something like that?
That's perfect.
Awesome. Any closing thoughts from you, Byung, for the listeners who've been listening this whole entire show? I think it's an hour. I think we're past. Are we past time? 14 minutes? We're past 14 minutes. Wow. Okay, so we're over time by a bit. I hadn't even been watching the clock, Jared. This last 14 minutes. Okay, so we're going on an hour and a half show roughly. Any closing thoughts for the listeners who've been hanging on to the end of the show here?
I think I would just say, I'll speak directly to the listeners who might be a little bit newer to programming, because I was definitely a person once who I didn't start programming really in earnest until end of high school, beginning of college, and it's a little bit old for a lot of programmers in kind of the software industry. And so if you're a person who's just learning to code and it just seems like there's this huge universe of things out there that you can never hope to know, just say, just keep going. Dive into source code, learn from the examples of other people. It's not rocket science at the end of the day, and once you get out the other end and you can build stuff on your own, it's like you've been given magic powers.
A lot of great advice to you from you as well from that Beyond Code interview. I can remember you saying, what would you go back and change? And I'll just give a snippet here because we'll link it up anyways. But you said go back and read more source code. And I thought that was such an interesting answer considering what you do now with Sourcegraph, because that's pretty much what the tool is that you built is read source code and creates more information based on that, some more information, some more logic on top of that. But we'll link that up. But I thought that was a pretty interesting thing too as well, just to kind of go back in and dive into the open source code out there and don't feel like there's a different way to get it right. That reading source code is probably the best option to learning the program.
Yep.
Well, Byung, thank you so much for coming on the show, and definitely thank you for your love for open source and your love for productivity for developers out there, and obviously all the things that Sourcegraph and your company is doing to prosper open source, but also to give us better tools to not have to rework every time or recreate the wheel every time, and to leverage the collective knowledge out there available in open source and all these open repositories to help us make our day-to-day lives a little bit better. And that's obviously a pretty cool thing. So sourcegraph.com is where you can find Sourcegraph, obviously. GitHub.com/Sourcegraph is where you can find a lot of their code. And with that, fellas, let's call this show done and say goodbye.
Thanks so much, Adam and Jared, for having me on the show. Really appreciate it. Love the changelog, and keep doing what you're doing.
Awesome. Thanks, man. We appreciate that.